Imagine this. A flight attendant denies a woman VIP access, thinking she's just another regular passenger. But what she doesn't know is that this woman is the CEO of the airline she works for. What happens next will leave you stunned and questioning everything you know about power and respect in the workplace. The day had started like any other for Sarah Miller, a woman who often flew for business, but today was different. She had been up early, preparing for a major meeting that could change the direction of her company. As the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech firms in the country, she was used to a life of constant travel, conferences, and important calls. She walked through the busy airport terminal with a quiet confidence, her heels clicking softly against the polished floors. Her black leather handbag rested in the crook of her arm, her phone in hand, as she reviewed the notes for her presentation. Her sleek business attire, a tailored coat and dress, made her blend in with the crowd, though there was an air of authority about her that few would miss if they noticed at all. After checking in and going through security, Sarah made her way to the first-class lounge. She was looking forward to a moment of calm before her flight, a chance to gather her thoughts. The lounge, usually a quiet sanctuary for high-profile passengers, was bustling with the usual mixture of business travelers and wealthy individuals. The staff behind the counter greeted her with the familiar polite smiles as she handed over her VIP access card. A flight attendant, a younger woman with a stiff uniform and sharp features, looked at Sarah and nodded curtly before she swiped the card. But then, something strange happened. The flight attendant's expression faltered, her eyes narrowing slightly as she glanced back down at the card. Sarah was used to quick service and often wasn't bothered by the formalities of flying. She had a lot on her mind, but the moment stretched into an uncomfortable pause. The attendant's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm sorry, but this access is not valid. You'll need to go to the general seating area," she said, with a tone that suggested it was a matter of policy, though there was no warmth in her voice. Sarah blinked, a flicker of surprise passing over her face. She wasn't someone who was ever told no, especially not in the places where she was used to being treated with the utmost respect. "I'm afraid there's some kind of mistake. I have access to this lounge," Sarah replied calmly, hoping to clear up the confusion. She had flown with this airline countless times, and her access had always been granted without issue. The attendant, however, didn't seem to be in any mood to listen. She simply looked at Sarah for a moment, almost as if evaluating her before repeating the same words. "Please, I insist. There's nothing I can do. You'll need to move to the main lounge." Sarah was taken aback. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out what had just happened. Was this a mistake, or was there something more to it? She noticed a few other passengers looking up from their seats, some whispering quietly among themselves, while others pretended not to notice. With a soft sigh, Sarah stood up, her grip tightening on her handbag. She wasn't one to make a scene, but she felt the sting of humiliation. She wasn't sure what had triggered this sudden and unexpected refusal, but it certainly wasn't the way she expected to be treated. As she walked past the attendant, she couldn't help but feel the eyes of the room on her, the subtle judgment hanging in the air. She knew she would have to address this, but for now, she decided it was best to simply walk away, her calm demeanor hiding the growing confusion in her mind. As Sarah made her way out of the lounge, she reached for her phone, her fingers moving quickly over the screen. She didn't let the flight attendant's words bother her too much. After all, there had to be some mistake. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something about the way she was dismissed felt wrong, and she wasn't about to let it slide. Her fingers moved across the screen, sending a brief message to her assistant, asking them to look into something while she boarded the plane. It wasn't an urgent matter yet, but she had a feeling that it might turn into something much bigger. With her phone tucked back into her bag, Sarah walked toward the gate with a new sense of resolve. The situation wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. As she took her seat on the plane, Sarah settled in, but her mind kept drifting back to the encounter with the flight attendant. Why had she been treated that way? And what would happen next? As the plane began its descent, Sarah could feel the tension building inside her. The flight had been uneventful, with her thoughts preoccupied by the strange interaction in the lounge. The hum of the engines, the soft chatter of passengers, and the steady click of seatbelts being fastened did little to ease her mind. Despite her composed exterior, she couldn't stop replaying the moment when the flight attendant had refused her access. It was nagging at her, like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, doing their usual checks and offering refreshments. One of them, a younger woman with kind eyes and a nervous smile, approached Sarah's seat, offering her a drink. Sarah smiled politely, taking the glass of water with a thank you. The flight attendant, Clara, seemed to sense that something was off, her eyes lingering on Sarah for just a second longer than necessary. She hesitated, then spoke softly. "Is everything okay, ma'am? You seem a little distant." Sarah appreciated the concern, but she didn't want to cause a scene. "I'm fine, thank you," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just a bit tired, I suppose." Clara nodded, sensing the conversation was over, but she seemed reluctant to leave. Her gaze flickered to the back of the plane, where the other flight attendants were making their rounds. Sarah noticed her hesitation and wondered what Clara had noticed, or if she had simply picked up on the unusual vibe Sarah was giving off. Clara, however, quickly turned and moved down the aisle, her footsteps quiet against the carpeted floor. As the flight continued, Sarah sat in silence, her fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. She hadn't expected to be treated the way she had earlier. In fact, it had rattled her more than she cared to admit. She had a reputation in the business world for being calm under pressure, for handling tough situations with grace. But this had been different. The indignity of being turned away from the VIP lounge was still fresh, and it gnawed at her. The idea of letting it go was impossible. Her phone buzzed briefly in her bag, snapping her back to reality. It was a message from her assistant. She pulled it out, reading it quickly. "I've looked into it, and your account was flagged for a minor security issue. Nothing serious, but it might have caused some confusion. I'll make sure to follow up." Sarah read the message twice. A minor security issue? That didn't explain the flight attendant's behavior at all. It seemed like an odd explanation, one that didn't sit right with her. She didn't believe it was just an accident anymore. There was something more to it, and she was determined to find out what. She quickly typed a reply. "Please dig deeper. Something doesn't add up." After hitting send, she leaned back in her seat, her expression thoughtful. The flight attendants were busy with their duties, and the rest of the passengers seemed lost in their own worlds, but Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. What was really going on? The plane cruised steadily through the sky as Sarah continued to mull over the events of the day. Her mind kept drifting back to that brief encounter in the lounge. She couldn't shake the feeling that the flight attendant's behavior wasn't just an isolated mistake. It was intentional, a subtle act of dismissal. Sarah had been denied access, yes, but something about the way it had been handled felt more personal than a mere mix-up. The thought made her uneasy. As the CEO of a successful company, she wasn't accustomed to being treated like this, and even more so, she wasn't used to letting things slide. She glanced around the cabin, her eyes falling on the flight attendants as they moved down the aisles, helping passengers, offering drinks, and making polite conversation. None of them seemed to notice the tension Sarah was feeling. The only one who caught her attention was the flight attendant from earlier, Miranda, the one who had denied her VIP access. Sarah hadn't caught her name in the lounge, but now, as Miranda passed by, she caught a glimpse of her name tag. The brief moment of eye contact between them felt charged. Miranda didn't look at Sarah with the same friendliness she had shown to other passengers. Instead, her gaze lingered just a moment too long. as though she recognized something in Sarah, though Sarah couldn't place it. Miranda's face was expressionless as she offered a polite smile to the nearby passengers, but her eyes seemed to flick back in Sarah's direction more than once. It wasn't lost on Sarah that Miranda hadn't apologized for the earlier incident, nor had she even acknowledged it. This bothered Sarah more than she realized. She wasn't someone who demanded apologies, but the silence felt like a refusal to acknowledge the wrong that had been done. She had always valued accountability, both in her professional life and in how she treated others. The lack of recognition of the situation irked her. With a sigh, Sarah reached for her phone again, unlocking it and pulling up her assistant's number. She tapped out a quick message. "Have you heard anything more? I'm sure this is more than just an error." She sent it off before leaning back into her seat. The flight was about halfway through, and she could sense that something had shifted in the air around her. It was as if the flight attendants, particularly Miranda, were beginning to realize that they may have made a misstep, or maybe they were just becoming uncomfortable with Sarah's quiet intensity. As the minutes passed, Sarah's phone buzzed with a new message from her assistant. "I've got something," it read. I dug deeper. "The issue might have been more than just a security mix-up. It looks like someone flagged you in their system for special handling. This wasn't an accident. I'll keep pushing, but we need to be careful." A cold chill ran down Sarah's spine as she read the message again. Special handling? That sounded too intentional to be a simple mix-up. She quickly typed back, "What do you mean flagged?" "Who flagged me?" But as she hit send, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't just a personal oversight. Someone had decided to take a closer look at her. Someone had made a decision. And now it seemed like everything was falling into place. She set the phone down and turned her gaze toward the front of the cabin, her mind working over the possibilities. Why would anyone have flagged her? Could this be a mistake on the airline's part, or was there something more to it? Just as she was lost in thought, the overhead intercom crackled to life, and the calm, familiar voice of the captain filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your trays are stowed. We'll be landing in approximately 20 minutes. Thank you for flying with us." The announcement broke her concentration, but the questions still lingered. The descent was inevitable, and as much as Sarah was used to handling challenges with poise, she knew the stakes were higher now. This wasn't just about an uncomfortable encounter with a flight attendant. This was about something bigger, something that felt like it was just starting to unfold. As the plane made its descent, Sarah's mind raced. The smooth descent felt like a blur to her. The hum of the engines, the soft clink of trays being put away, the small chatter of passengers preparing for landing, all of it seemed distant and muffled as she pondered the situation she found herself in. Every little detail from the flight replayed in her mind. Miranda's dismissive behavior, the cold refusal to recognize Sarah's VIP status, and the cryptic message from her assistant were all parts of a puzzle she couldn't quite fit together. She knew she had to take action. She had handled high-pressure situations before, from board meetings to potential mergers. But this was different. This wasn't about a business deal or a presentation. This was about respect. The feeling of being undermined and dismissed had taken root deep inside her. She wasn't used to being disrespected, especially not in a place where she had paid for and expected the highest level of service. But the more she thought about it, the clearer it became that Miranda's actions had been deliberate. There was no mistake here. Someone had decided to challenge Sarah, and while it was possible that it had been a misunderstanding, Sarah felt in her gut that there was more to the story. This wasn't just about a flight attendant making a bad call. It was about something deeper, something she was starting to feel more and more certain of. Miranda hadn't acted on her own. She had been told to do something, perhaps to push boundaries, to test a limit. Sarah had worked hard to earn her place in this world, and no one was going to take that away from her. Her phone buzzed once again, breaking her from her thoughts. She quickly unlocked it, her eyes scanning the new message from her assistant. "I've got the full details. The flagging issue wasn't random. It looks like the system was updated recently to categorize VIP customers differently. Someone made the decision to flag your name for extra scrutiny. I don't have a name yet, but I'll keep digging." Sarah's fingers tightened around her phone as she processed the message. So, it wasn't a mistake after all. Someone had specifically chosen to scrutinize her, to treat her differently from the other passengers. The weight of the situation was beginning to sink in. This wasn't about a simple misunderstanding. This was personal. Someone had targeted her, and Sarah was determined to figure out who and why. As the plane neared its final approach, Sarah set her phone down, her gaze moving toward the front of the cabin once more. She watched as Miranda and the other flight attendants prepared for landing, moving through the aisles with practiced ease. The contrast between Miranda's business-like demeanor and Sarah's simmering frustration couldn't have been starker. Sarah didn't want to confront Miranda right now, but she needed answers, and she needed them quickly. The moment the plane landed, she knew she would make her move. The fasten seatbelt sign flickered on as the plane touched down with a soft jolt. As the wheels hit the runway, Sarah's pulse quickened. The landing had felt like the beginning of something, not the end. The calm around her was about to shatter. Her mind was clear now. The plan was set. She would take control of this situation. She would find out who was behind the decision to flag her. And when she did, there would be consequences. For them, and for anyone who ever underestimated her again. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Sarah grabbed her bag from under the seat and stood, smoothing down her coat. She had no intention of letting the day end without answers. The game was just beginning, and she was ready to play. The plane came to a complete stop, and the seatbelt sign flickered off, signaling that passengers could begin to gather their things. Sarah stood, gathering her belongings with a sense of purpose, though her mind was still racing. As she stepped into the aisle, she saw Miranda near the front, speaking briefly with another flight attendant. There was a noticeable tension in the air, as if the other attendants were trying to avoid her gaze, and Sarah's instincts told her that something wasn't right. She had been dismissed, yes, but there was something more lingering behind it. The unease that had been building in her chest was only growing. As she walked toward the exit, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Miranda was watching her. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Sarah saw something flicker in Miranda's gaze, perhaps guilt or uncertainty, but whatever it was, it made Sarah's resolve firm. She had no idea what had been said behind closed doors, but it was clear now that the flight attendant was feeling the weight of the situation. Sarah couldn't let this go. With a deep breath, Sarah stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal. The usual rush of passengers disembarking filled the air, but she felt strangely alone in the sea of people. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her attention away from the crowd. It was a new message from her assistant. "I've found out who flagged you. It was someone in the customer service department, a mid-level manager named Rachel Winters. She updated the system, and your name was added to the list of people to be flagged for special treatment. I'm getting more details, but that's the name behind the decision." Rachel Winters. The name hit Sarah like a wave of realization. She'd never heard of Rachel Winters, but it was clear now that the issue wasn't just a misunderstanding with Miranda. It had been orchestrated by someone higher up, someone who had decided to make a judgment about her without even knowing who she was. Sarah took a slow breath, steadying herself before she moved toward the baggage claim. Her assistant was already digging deeper into Rachel Winters' background, but for now, she needed to focus on one thing: confronting Miranda and getting answers. She wasn't about to let anyone play games with her, especially not in a place where she had every right to be treated with respect. As Sarah made her way toward the luggage area, she caught sight of the airline's customer service desk. A few employees were gathered, and one of them was speaking to an irate passenger. Sarah didn't pay them much mind, but something about the scene made her feel the weight of the situation growing heavier. Hey, this wasn't just about one flight attendant's mistake. It was about an entire system that had failed her. She took a moment to gather her thoughts. Confronting Miranda might not be enough. She needed to get to the bottom of what had really happened. Who was pulling the strings behind the scenes? Who thought they could get away with treating someone like Sarah so carelessly? As she reached the luggage carousel, her phone buzzed again, a message from her assistant. "Rachel Winters is at the airport today. I've found her schedule. She's at the office in the terminal for a meeting. I'll send you more info soon, but you might want to speak to her directly." Everything was lining up. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, and Sarah felt a quiet, determined fire burning inside her. It was time to take control of the narrative. She wasn't going to let this go without making sure everyone knew exactly what had happened and why it couldn't be allowed to happen again. Sarah glanced around the terminal, spotting the signs for the airline office nearby. She had an appointment to keep, and she was ready to make her presence known. The feeling of being underestimated, of being dismissed, had triggered something inside her. And now she was about to make sure that no one would ever make the same mistake again. As Sarah approached the airline office, her pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of her decision settling in. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was her making a stand. She was used to boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations, but this felt different. This wasn't about a business deal or a financial opportunity. This was about respect. This was about showing that no one, regardless of their position, had the right to treat her as though she didn't belong. The office was tucked away in a quiet corner of the terminal, away from the hustle and bustle of the main concourse. As she stepped inside, the sterile, impersonal feel of the space hit her. It was all polished floors and glass walls, giving the impression of efficiency, but to Sarah, it felt cold and distant. A receptionist looked up as she entered, her eyes widening for a moment before she quickly regained her composure. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her voice professional but wary. "I need to speak with Rachel Winters," Sarah said, her tone calm but firm. "It's urgent." The receptionist hesitated, glancing down at her computer screen. "Ms. Winters is in a meeting right now, but I can check if she's available." She paused for a moment before standing up and heading toward the back. Sarah stood still, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the glass walls of the office. The situation was becoming more real with every passing second. She had a feeling Rachel Winters had no idea what was about to come her way. As Sarah waited, her thoughts turned back to the earlier events on the plane. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that this wasn't just about a flight attendant making an innocent mistake. Miranda had been the face of it, but the system that had flagged her, that had marked her for extra scrutiny, was no accident. It had been set in motion by someone who thought they could get away with making a judgment about her. It wasn't about an individual mistake. It was about a deeper issue, an issue that needed to be addressed, not just for her sake, but for anyone else who might find themselves in a similar position. The receptionist returned, her face tight. "Ms. Winters will see you now. Please follow me." Sarah followed the receptionist down a narrow hallway, each step echoing against the polished floors. As they approached the door to Rachel's office, Sarah felt her heart beat a little faster. She wasn't nervous, but the adrenaline was starting to kick in. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. The moment she would take control of the situation. The receptionist knocked on the door before opening it slightly. "Ms. Winters, Ms. Miller is here to see you." A voice from inside called out, "Send her in!" The receptionist stepped aside, and Sarah walked into the office. Rachel Winters, a woman in her late 30s with short, dark hair and a sharp suit, sat behind a large wooden desk. She looked up with an air of professionalism, but her eyes flickered with something else. something Sarah couldn't quite place. It was a mixture of surprise and perhaps a little concern. "Ms. Miller, it's good to see you," Rachel said, standing up and offering her hand. "How can I help you today?" Sarah took the hand, giving it a firm shake. "We need to talk about what happened earlier today," she said calmly, but her words held weight. "And I need you to explain why I was flagged for special treatment." Rachel's face tightened for a moment, the slightest flicker of tension crossing her features before she quickly masked it with a smile. "I'm not sure what you mean. Can you clarify?" Sarah didn't flinch. "I was denied access to the VIP lounge. The flight attendant refused to honor my VIP status, and when I asked for clarification, she made it clear that I wasn't supposed to be there. I've now learned that my name was flagged for extra scrutiny, and I want to know why." Rachel's smile faltered, and for the first time Sarah saw a crack in the facade. "I see," Rachel said slowly, her voice a little quieter now. "That shouldn't have happened. Let me assure you, the flagging process is something we take very seriously. There must have been a misunderstanding." Sarah leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Rachel's. "A misunderstanding? Really?" Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "I don't believe this was an accident, Rachel. I think someone decided to treat me differently, and I want to know why." The silence between them stretched for a moment, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Rachel's eyes flickered toward the door, as if weighing her options, before she took a deep breath and sat back in her chair. "I understand your frustration," she said, her voice now tinged with a hint of defensiveness, "but I assure you everything was handled according to protocol." "Protocol?" Sarah repeated. "So you're telling me that it's protocol to flag someone without reason? That it's protocol to deny a VIP access without a legitimate cause?" "I don't think so, Rachel. I want to know who made that decision and why. Now." Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly, her professional mask slipping. "It's not as simple as you think, Ms. Miller. There are reasons for everything that happens in this company." "And those reasons better be good," Sarah shot back. "Because I'm not walking out of this office without answers." For the first time, Sarah saw Rachel's facade crack completely. It was clear now, whatever was happening, it wasn't just a mistake. And as the tension between them deepened, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning of what would become a much larger confrontation. Rachel hesitated, her fingers tapping nervously on the desk as she weighed her words. Sarah could see the shift in her demeanor. The calm exterior that had once been a wall of professionalism was starting to crumble. It was a sign that she knew she was cornered, and the information Sarah was seeking was now only moments away from being revealed. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't going to let Rachel play this down. She needed answers, and she would get them. Finally, Rachel spoke, her voice quieter now, tinged with a sense of unease. "It wasn't just one person, Ms. Miller," she said slowly. "The decision to flag certain passengers for additional scrutiny came from higher up. The change was implemented recently as part of an effort to, improve the efficiency of customer service and identify patterns in frequent travelers." Sarah's mind raced as she processed the information. "So you're telling me that someone at the top decided to flag me specifically, without any actual reason?" Sarah's voice remained steady, but her words carried weight. "Do I look like a problem to you?" Rachel looked away briefly, her discomfort palpable. She hadn't expected Sarah to react so calmly. Most people would have been angry or upset by this point, but Sarah had a different energy, one of quiet control that was far more unnerving. "It wasn't personal," Rachel replied quickly. "It's part of a broader system designed to spot patterns in high-profile passengers. Sometimes people are flagged for various reasons, but it's not meant to be discriminatory." "Not meant to be discriminatory?" Sarah repeated, her eyes narrowing. "How do you explain what happened today, then?" I wasn't just flagged, I was treated like an inconvenience, like I didn't belong in the VIP lounge. That wasn't protocol, Rachel. That was a decision, and someone made it. Rachel shifted in her seat, looking uncomfortable. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Sarah continued. I want to know who made the decision to flag me. Who authorized this? I'm sure you know who's responsible. I'll be getting to the bottom of this, one way or another. For a moment, Rachel didn't respond. Her gaze flickered to the corner of the office, her lips pressed into a thin line. It was clear she wasn't ready to give up the name so easily. But Sarah wasn't backing down. She had waited too long for this. Her reputation, her integrity, had been questioned today in a way she had never experienced before, and she wasn't about to let anyone get away with it, not when there was so much at stake. Finally, Rachel sighed, her shoulders slumping as if she had resigned herself to the inevitable. It was Rachel Winters, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I authorized the changes to the system. I suggested the flags as part of a broader initiative. But it wasn't supposed to work like this. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Rachel Winters, the person responsible for this entire fiasco, was sitting right across from her. But Sarah didn't let the shock show. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. Why me? She asked quietly. Why did you feel the need to flag me, of all people? I've flown with your airline countless times. I've been loyal, and I've paid my dues. Why single me out? Rachel opened her mouth but quickly closed it again, her eyes darting to the desk. It wasn't personal, she repeated, but this time the words seemed empty. It's just part of the new system we're testing. We flagged a list of passengers for additional monitoring to see how they respond to certain situations. It's a way of tracking behavior. So you were testing me? Sarah asked, her voice cold, and I failed the test? She could feel her frustration bubbling up, but she kept it in check. She wasn't here to argue. She was here to make sure this never happened again. Rachel didn't meet her eyes. Instead, she picked up a pen and began to fiddle with it, clearly uncomfortable under Sarah's gaze. We're still in the pilot phase of the new system, she explained, her voice losing its earlier confidence. We're testing different approaches, and you just happen to be one of the flagged passengers. It wasn't supposed to escalate to this point. Sarah's mind was reeling, but she kept her cool. Testing? On a paying customer? And you didn't think to ask if this would cause problems? If this would make someone feel singled out? Her voice softened slightly, but the impact of her words was clear. You underestimated me, Rachel. And now, because of your little test, I'm going to make sure this issue is handled properly. Rachel looked up at Sarah for the first time, her face pale. Please don't. I never intended for this to become a bigger issue. I thought it was just a routine change. Something small, not something that would affect people like you. Sarah's eyes narrowed. It's always the small things that add up, Rachel. This isn't just about me. It's about anyone who might be treated like this. The system you created isn't just flawed. It's dangerous. You can't just flag people and expect them to accept it without question. This needs to change, and I'm going to make sure it does. Rachel nodded, her face a mixture of resignation and fear. She knew this was bigger than her now. She had made a mistake, and now Sarah Miller, the CEO of a major company, was going to hold her accountable. As Sarah stood up from the chair, she straightened her coat, feeling a sense of finality. I expect a full report on this. I want to know who else was flagged and why. And I'll be expecting you to take responsibility for this, Sarah said, her tone firm. If you want to keep your job, I suggest you get it together before this goes public. Rachel didn't say anything as Sarah turned to leave, but her eyes followed Sarah out of the office. Sarah's steps were deliberate, her mind already shifting to the next phase of the plan. She wouldn't let this go, not until the entire system was reevaluated and the people responsible were held accountable. The pieces were falling into place, and Sarah was in control now. As Sarah walked out of the office, her steps were steady, but her mind was racing. The conversation with Rachel Winters had given her more than she had expected, but it also confirmed everything she had feared. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was part of a larger system of discrimination, one that was being tested on unsuspecting passengers. Sarah knew she couldn't let this go. She wasn't just angry for herself anymore. She was angry for anyone who might suffer from this flawed, biased system. She reached the elevator, her fingers pressing the button with purpose. The doors opened, and she stepped inside, taking a deep breath. She hadn't expected to find answers so quickly, but now that she had them, she was already thinking about how to take action. Rachel Winters might have been the face of the decision, but Sarah knew there were bigger forces at play. Whoever had decided to flag passengers for special treatment had to be stopped. This wasn't just about one flight attendant or one department. This was about an entire system that had failed. The elevator doors closed, and Sarah leaned against the wall, her thoughts focused on what came next. She knew she needed to escalate this, but how? Should she go straight to the board of directors, or should she gather more evidence before taking her next step? There was no room for mistakes now. Her position as CEO had never felt so vulnerable, but it had also never felt so powerful. She had the ability to make change, to expose the corruption that was hidden behind a corporate facade, and she was going to use it. Her phone buzzed in her hand, pulling her from her thoughts. It was another message from her assistant. "I've got the latest report. The system flagging wasn't limited to just your name. Others were flagged too, though the reasons seem inconsistent. Some passengers were marked for VIP status confusion, while others were marked for testing compliance. But there's a pattern here. The flagged passengers share one thing in common. They're all high-status individuals." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. High-status individuals. It was no coincidence. The system was targeting people who were either frequent flyers or those with high-profile careers. Sarah's own name had been flagged not because of any security concerns, but because of her position. Because she was someone whose presence would likely challenge the status quo. The realization hit her hard. It wasn't just about an isolated mistake. It was about control, about keeping certain people in check. It was about power. The elevator dinged, signaling her arrival on the ground floor. Sarah stepped out, her mind now set. She would take this to the board. The airline was supposed to serve its customers, not target them for arbitrary reasons. She couldn't let this slip through the cracks, not when she had the power to make it right. As she walked toward the exit, her phone buzzed again. It was a call this time, a number she didn't recognize. With a quick glance, she answered. "Hello? Ms. Miller?" a voice on the other end said. "This is Greg Daniels from the Board of Directors. I understand you've been having some concerns with the recent changes to the system." His voice was professional, but there was an undertone of something else, something that sounded like caution. "We've received some feedback, and I think it's time for a discussion." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "I think we should talk," she replied, her voice steady. "But not just about feedback. We need to talk about accountability and the system you've put in place." She could hear the slight shift in his voice. "I agree. Let's meet and discuss the situation." "I'll be at the office tomorrow morning," Sarah said, her resolve firm. "I'll expect a full review of this, starting with the flagged passengers and ending with an explanation for the reasoning behind these decisions. I'm not leaving until we have some answers." There was a long pause on the other end. Finally, Greg spoke again, his tone resigned. "Understood, Ms. Miller. I'll be there." The call ended, and Sarah let out a slow breath. The pieces were falling into place, and now the battle was officially on. It wasn't just about fixing the system anymore. It was about ensuring that something like this never happened again. She wouldn't allow anyone to be treated unfairly based on assumptions or biases. As she stepped into her car, Sarah knew this was only the beginning. The wheels were in motion, and now it was time to make sure they kept turning. The next morning came quickly, and Sarah walked into the office with a newfound sense of determination. She had spent the entire night drafting notes, reviewing the airline's policies, and preparing for the meeting with the board of directors. This wasn't just about reclaiming her dignity, this was about ensuring that the system would be overhauled, that the kind of bias she had encountered would be eliminated. She had no intention of walking out of that room until she knew she had a plan of action in place. The office was quiet when she arrived, the soft hum of conversation and the murmur of phone calls filling the air. As Sarah walked through the halls, the employees she passed greeted her with polite smiles, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. Sarah could feel the weight of their eyes on her. Everyone knew something was about to happen. She was ready for it. When she entered the boardroom, the faces of the directors were already waiting for her. They were seated around a large, polished table, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. Greg Daniels, the head of the board, stood up and gestured for her to sit. "Ms. Miller, thank you for meeting with us on such short notice," he said, his voice professional but tinged with a note of hesitation. Sarah took her seat, her posture straight and unwavering. "Thank you for making time," she replied, her voice calm but laced with authority. "But let's not waste any more time. I've come here to discuss something that should have been addressed before it reached this point." Greg nodded, motioning for the others to be quiet. "Of course. We understand you've been having concerns regarding the recent changes to our passenger monitoring system. Please, share your thoughts." Without missing a beat, Sarah began. "It's not just a concern, Mr. Daniels. It's a problem, a serious problem." She paused, meeting the eyes of each board member. "You have a system in place that flags passengers, specifically high-status individuals, for unnecessary scrutiny. I was flagged, and so were others. And what's worse, it's based on assumptions. It's discriminatory, and it's damaging to the airline's reputation." The room was silent for a long moment. Sarah's words hung in the air, and she could see the board members processing the weight of what she had said. She wasn't asking for a discussion. She was demanding action. "I've spoken to Rachel Winters," Sarah continued, her tone firm. "She's the one who authorized this flagging system, but I'm sure this goes beyond her. It's a systemic issue. You're targeting your loyal customers based on their status, and it needs to stop now." Greg Daniels looked uncomfortable, but nodded. "We've been experimenting with this system, trying to improve customer service, but we didn't anticipate the issues that have arisen. We'll look into the details and take immediate action." "That's not enough," Sarah said sharply. "I need concrete steps, a full review of the flagged passengers, an overhaul of the system, and an apology to those affected. And not just an apology, accountability. I expect those responsible for this mess to be held accountable." The board members exchanged glances. Sarah could see the unease in their eyes. This was more than just an isolated incident. It was a potential PR nightmare, and the longer they sat on it, the worse it would get. "I want a public statement," Sarah continued, her voice unwavering. "I want this to be handled transparently. I'll be the first to back this change, but I won't stand for a cover-up. This ends now, or the consequences will be far worse for the company." Greg Daniels seemed to hesitate for a moment longer before nodding. "We understand, Ms. Miller. You'll have our full cooperation. We'll begin the review and implement changes immediately." Sarah stood up, her gaze sweeping across the room one final time. "Good," she said, her voice resolute. "I'll be expecting updates, and I'll be watching closely. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone you serve. Make sure you don't forget that." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out of the room, her steps firm and purposeful. She had made her point. Now it was up to the board to follow through. But as Sarah walked down the hallway, she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a long process of change. and she was ready to see it through. The days following the meeting with the board were a whirlwind. Sarah's words had left an impression, but it wasn't just her insistence on change that had shaken things up. It was the underlying message. The company had failed its customers, and that failure was going to be exposed if they didn't act quickly. She was relentless now. Every conversation she had was about pushing the airline toward transparency, accountability, and reform. As promised, the board began the review process, but Sarah knew it would take time to clean up the mess. In the meantime, she continued to focus on her own company's operations, but the issue with the airline was never far from her mind. She had made it clear that this wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly by the system. She received updates daily, each one more promising than the last. The flagged passengers were being reviewed and changes were being made to the monitoring system. One evening, Sarah sat in her office, looking over her notes and emails, when she received a call from her assistant. "Ms. Miller," the assistant said, sounding a bit surprised. "The airline just released a public statement. They're addressing the issues you raised. They've apologized for the flagging system, and they're implementing a full review of their policies." The CEO personally signed off on the statement. A sense of satisfaction settled over Sarah, but it wasn't enough. The apology was a good start, but she knew it had to go beyond words. "That's a start, but I want to see the actions behind it," she said. "Make sure the press knows this isn't the end of the story. The real work starts now." The assistant hesitated. "I'll make sure of it, Ms. Miller, but there's something else. The CEO wants to meet with you. They're requesting a discussion to go over the steps they're taking." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. She wasn't sure what to make of the request. The airline's CEO had been silent through the whole ordeal, but now they wanted to speak to her directly. It wasn't a coincidence. The CEO knew the gravity of the situation and was likely looking for a way to rebuild their image. "Set it up," Sarah replied, her voice calm but with an edge. "I'll meet with them, but I want to be clear, this isn't about making nice. I'm not interested in pleasantries. I want a real plan, and I expect to see results." She hung up, her mind already turning. This meeting could be the final piece of the puzzle, the chance to solidify the changes she had fought for. But one thing was clear, she wasn't going to settle for anything less than full accountability. She had started this fight, and she would finish it on her terms. The meeting with the CEO of the airline was scheduled for the following day, and Sarah had made sure she was prepared. The conference room where they were to meet was sleek and modern, with large windows letting in natural light, a subtle yet clear reminder of the corporate world Sarah had navigated for years. As she entered the room, she was met with the gaze of the airline's CEO, a middle-aged man with silver hair, neatly combed, and a suit that looked far too expensive for comfort. He stood extending his hand with a tight smile. "Ms. Miller, it's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for agreeing to sit down with me." Sarah shook his hand firmly, her grip strong, her posture upright. "The pleasure's mine," she replied coolly, her voice steady. She took her seat without waiting for a prompt, crossing her legs, her eyes fixed on the CEO, who had already seated himself across the table. The CEO cleared his throat and folded his hands in front of him. "I want to begin by acknowledging the situation that has unfolded. I understand the concerns you've raised, and I want to assure you that we are taking them very seriously." Sarah didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I appreciate the acknowledgement, but I'm not here for generalities. I'm here because the airline has failed its customers and me, and now you have the chance to fix it. I'm not looking for a vague statement. I want specific actions. If you're serious about fixing the issue, I need to hear the details." The CEO's eyes briefly flickered with a flash of unease before he regained his composure. "I understand, Ms. Miller. The review process is already underway. We've begun an internal investigation into the flagged passenger system and its implementation. We're addressing the flaws in the system, and revisiting our training protocols for all staff members. I assure you, we are committed to making things right." Sarah listened, but she wasn't satisfied. "I want to know who made the decision to flag passengers like me," she said, her tone unwavering. "Who authorized this special treatment, and why was it even considered in the first place?" The CEO leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the table as if he were weighing the best way to respond. "That decision came from the customer service department," he said carefully. "It was meant to improve efficiency by identifying high-priority passengers, but I admit that the implementation was flawed. No one intended for it to cause harm, but I understand how it has now created unnecessary tension." "Intention isn't the issue," Sarah countered sharply. "The issue is the outcome. It didn't just cause harm. It created a system where passengers like me, customers who have been loyal to your airline, are treated like they don't belong. You created a system of unnecessary surveillance based on assumptions and biases, and that needs to be corrected immediately." The CEO looked slightly defensive, but there was no denying the force of Sarah's words. "I understand your frustration. I'm committed to ensuring that the system is reformed," he replied, his voice more measured now. "But it will take time. These changes won't happen overnight." "Time is something I don't have," Sarah said flatly. "This system was put in place without proper oversight. And now it's about accountability. If the people responsible for this decision don't face consequences, then nothing will truly change. You need to make that clear, not just internally, but to the public." The CEO paused, his brow furrowed in thought. "I can't promise immediate action for everyone involved, but I'll ensure that a full report is given, and those responsible will be addressed accordingly. And as for the public statement, we're preparing one. It will acknowledge the oversight and outline the steps we're taking to correct it." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, but she held her ground. "That's a good start, but you need to do more. If you want your customers to trust you again, you'll need to show them that you're not just sorry, that you've learned from this and will never let it happen again." The CEO nodded, his expression now one of reluctant agreement. "I hear you, Ms. Miller. We will take full responsibility, and I will personally oversee the reforms." Sarah sat back in her chair, satisfied that she had made her point. The ball was in their court now, but she knew this was just the beginning. The meeting was a crucial step, but she was no longer going to wait for change to happen. She was going to make sure it did. After the meeting with the CEO, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment, but there was still much work ahead. She had made her demands clear, and now it was up to the airline to follow through. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be pushback, there would be delays, and there would be those who tried to brush the issue under the rug. But she wasn't going to let that happen. She had seen the cracks in the system, and now it was her responsibility to ensure those cracks were fixed. Over the next few days, the media picked up the story. News outlets reported on the airline's public statement, but they also questioned the company's past practices. Sarah's name was mentioned in almost every article, but it wasn't about her fame or success. It was about the message she had sent. She had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, she had sparked a conversation about accountability in the corporate world. As she read the articles, Sarah's satisfaction grew, but so did her sense of purpose. This was no longer just about her personal experience. This was about creating lasting change. She received a flood of messages from customers, some expressing gratitude for standing up for them, others sharing their own stories of unfair treatment. The outpouring of support only strengthened her resolve. She had made a difference, but the real work was just beginning. Phased. She had been through much worse in her career, and this was just another challenge to overcome. She welcomed the criticism, knowing it was a sign that her efforts were making waves. One afternoon, as Sarah was reviewing the latest report from her assistant about the platform's growth, her phone rang. It was a familiar number, the CEO of the airline. Her initial reaction was a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The CEO had been relatively quiet after their last meeting, so Sarah was curious about what this call could mean. "Ms. Miller," the CEO said, his voice more urgent than she had heard it before, "I wanted to reach out personally to let you know that we've made some significant progress since our last conversation. But more importantly, I'm asking for your help. The changes we've implemented are working, but we're facing some backlash from other stakeholders within the company. Some are resisting the new direction. We need your support to make sure the reforms stick." Sarah listened carefully, her mind already working. She knew this was a pivotal moment. The airline had made strides, but if internal resistance was starting to build, the reforms could stall. "I'm willing to help, but it's going to take more than just a little push from me," Sarah replied. "If you want the changes to truly stick, you need to do more than just appease the board members. You need to create a culture shift that's deep and lasting. I'll back you, but I need to see that you're fully committed to the long-term changes, not just for the sake of appearances." The CEO was silent for a moment, but when he spoke again, Sarah could tell he had made a decision. "We are committed. We've already scheduled a meeting with the board to discuss making the reforms permanent, and I want you there. I believe your presence could help sway the rest of the team." "I'll be there," Sarah said, her voice firm. "But understand this, it's not just about showing up. It's about showing true leadership. You need to prove that this is more than just a response to public pressure. If you're serious about these changes, we need to hold everyone, from the top down, accountable. If that means taking tough actions, then that's what needs to happen." The CEO hesitated, but then agreed, clearly understanding the gravity of what Sarah was saying. "Thank you, Ms. Miller. We'll make sure everything is in order for the meeting. I'll send you the details." As Sarah hung up the phone, she felt a mix of anticipation and determination. The battle wasn't over yet. The airline's reform was at a crossroads, and now was the time to double down on the work they had started. She wasn't just going to show up for a meeting, she was going to ensure that the airline's leadership understood that true change required more than just a superficial shift. The real work was still ahead, and Sarah was ready to lead the charge. The meeting with the airline's board of directors was set for the following week, and Sarah made sure she was fully prepared. She spent the days leading up to it, reveille on his face. "You're right, Ms. Miller. We're in this for the long haul, and we'll make sure we follow through. I appreciate your candor and your commitment to making sure this isn't just a temporary fix." As the meeting continued, Sarah could see that the board was beginning to realize the magnitude of the changes ahead. This wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick. But they had no choice now. The groundwork had been laid, and the momentum was unstoppable. Sarah knew it would take time, but she was prepared to stay in the fight, pushing until every promise made was kept and every wrong righted. The real work was just beginning. The weeks that followed were intense. The airline's leadership, under pressure from Sarah's insistence, had begun taking the necessary steps to address the systemic issues she had identified. While there was still resistance from certain corners of the company, Sarah was resolute. She held frequent check-ins with the CEO and the board, making sure that they were following through with their commitments. She knew that change could not be rushed, but it had to be constant. Any hint of complacency would undo all the progress that had been made. Sarah's efforts weren't limited to the airline anymore. The platform she had created to promote corporate accountability was now reaching new heights. Businesses from a variety of industries had joined the initiative, some in search of help to improve their own practices, others simply wanting to be part of a growing movement. Sarah's name had become synonymous with fairness and transparency in the corporate world, and she was determined to use her influence to keep pushing for systemic change. One afternoon, Sarah was in a meeting with a group of executives from a tech giant that had recently joined the platform. As they discussed the next steps in their partnership, her assistant's voice interrupted her thoughts with an urgent message. "Ms. Miller, there's breaking news. The airline just announced the permanent implementation of all the reforms you've been advocating for. They've made a public statement, not just a press release, but a comprehensive plan outlining the steps they've taken, with details of how they're holding their staff accountable at every level. They're setting up a task force to monitor progress, and they've launched a new customer transparency initiative." Sarah took a moment to absorb the news. The statement was a huge victory, not just for her, but for everyone who had been affected by the biased system she had fought against. She could feel a wave of satisfaction wash over her, knowing that her relentless pursuit of justice had led to real, lasting change. But she also knew that this was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. After the meeting, Sarah sat at her desk, staring out the window as she reflected on the journey. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, moments where it seemed like the battle would never end. But now, as she looked back at everything she had accomplished, she felt an overwhelming sense of pride. The airline had made the right decision, and it wasn't just about fixing one company. It was about showing the world that businesses could and should be held accountable for how they treated their customers. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from her assistant. "There's more. The board has approved a new internal policy to reward employees who go above and beyond to create positive customer experiences. They've also committed to making diversity and inclusion metrics a part of their annual performance reviews." Sarah smiled, knowing that these weren't just small, symbolic gestures. These were steps that would foster an environment where fairness and equality were integral parts of the company's DNA. The cultural shift she had been fighting for was finally taking root. Months passed, and the airline's transformation became a model for other companies to follow. Sarah continued to work tirelessly, not only keeping an eye on the airline's progress, but also expanding the platform that had started it all. Her mission to promote corporate transparency and fairness was no longer a personal vendetta. It had become a movement, one that was beginning to change the very fabric of how businesses operated. The changes at the airline were visible. Customer feedback was overwhelmingly positive, and employees who had once been resistant to the reforms now spoke out in support of them. It wasn't easy for everyone to accept the new policies, but those who embraced the changes saw firsthand how much better the working environment had become. The customer complaints had dropped significantly, and there was a noticeable shift in the company's overall culture. What had once been a toxic, top-down system was now becoming a more inclusive, employee-focused, and customer-centric operation. But even as the airline was getting back on track, Sarah knew that the fight wasn't over. There were still businesses out there that would try to exploit their customers, that would try to sweep their mistakes under the rug. That's why Sarah kept pushing forward, using her influence to continue advocating for fairness and accountability in all sectors. Every victory, no matter how big or small, was a reminder that change was possible. It just took determination, grit, and a refusal to accept the status quo. One day, Sarah received a call from a journalist who had been following her journey. "You've become a powerful voice for corporate reform," the journalist said. "What's next for you?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, taking a moment to reflect. "Next," she repeated with a smile. "Next, we make sure this is just the beginning. We'll keep pushing until every company is held to the same standard. No one should ever have to be treated like I was. And if I have anything to say about it, they won't be." As she hung up the phone, Sarah looked out over the city skyline, her thoughts focused on the future. The world was changing, slowly but surely, and Sarah Miller would be at the forefront, leading the charge for a world where corporate accountability wasn't just an idea, but a reality. She had started a revolution, and now there was no turning back.